If the Denver Broncos lose on Sunday to the Las Vegas Raiders, will George Paton or Broncos ownership make any changes? If they do, if that is the case, what are the Broncos playing for on Sunday? And if there were any changes, what would it look like? You get that and much more on today's brand new episode, Locked On Broncos.
You are Locked On Broncos, your daily Denver Broncos podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
What's up, Broncos Country? Welcome into a brand new episode, Locked On Broncos, your daily Denver Broncos podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Thank you so much to everybody in Broncos Country for tuning in and making Locked On Broncos your first listen of the day every single day. Free and available everywhere you get your podcast in audio format, or whether you're watching us on YouTube. If you're doing that, do us a favor, hit that subscribe button or that follow button down below so you never miss a day's worth of Denver Broncos news, content, coverage, and more every single day, all year long, from the South Stands to the end zone. I'm your host, as always, Cody Roark, Broncos reporter for Mile High Sports. I'm on the ground every day in Dove Valley covering practice, covering games home and away. You get that coverage, milehighsports.com. Plus here, the Locked On Broncos podcast. My co-host, Sarah Bettinger, is out this week as he's in Disney World enjoying time with his family. Well-deserved there, and avoiding the turmoil that is here in Broncos Country with a 3-6 record and a losing season here once again here. But I think there's a major question that we have to dive into on today's episode, Locked On Broncos. This week's matchup against the Las Vegas Raiders at home, Empower Field, at Mile High. It is big for the Broncos. It's big for the Raiders as well. We'll have a crossover episode with your boy Q this week here on the Locked On Broncos podcast for Crossover Thursday. But there's a lot at stake for this Broncos football team in Sunday's matchup. We've talked about just the fact that the season from a playoff standpoint, not likely for the Broncos, right? But there's so much more that this team still has to play for, and this weekend's game could be a defining moment for the season. And it could be in a negative way, could be in a positive way as well. So let's dive into what's at stake for the Broncos against the Las Vegas Raiders. Now, I think first and foremost, pride, right? When you take a look at this Broncos-Raiders rivalry over the course of its history, it's been one of the most prestigious in the National Football League. But as of late, hasn't really been a rivalry in the sense for the Broncos. As the Broncos, they've lost 5 straight games against the Las Vegas Raiders. If they lose on Sunday, that would make it 6 consecutive times. And that's something that you want to avoid in this game. And look, I look at the Broncos defense. That's been the bright spot all year long. The last time these two teams played, they played against Josh Jacobs. Josh Jacobs got right, and he got going this year against the Broncos with a 2-touchdown performance, over 140 yards rushing. And Denver just had moments in that game where they couldn't wrap him up. They arm tackled. One guy tried to bring the boom. They tried to just hit and dislodge the ball, wrap him up. I think when you play Josh Jacobs this week, the game plan is going to be a little bit different, right? Because for Denver, they're coming off of a performance defensively where they held Derrick Henry to only 53 yards rushing. Unheard of in most situations when you look at a team that has to play against Derrick Henry. They don't usually hold him to that type of thing. So hats off to Ejiro Evero, the Broncos defense. But for this matchup in particular, the Broncos, they are playing for pride. And they're also playing for another element here as well. And that is the fan base, the fans in Broncos Country. Because I can tell you this, fans have been very vocal about their displeasure for the season, how things have gone, but more so at home. If you lose to the Raiders, that's going to send a clear-cut message. The fans will. I mean, the fans left during an overtime game on Thursday Night Football, primetime action, because of how bad the offense was performing. I think if the Broncos come out and they struggle in this game against the Raiders at home, I think the fans are going to send a very, very clear message to the Walton-Penner Family Ownership group that it's just not acceptable. And I think that how they perform on Sunday could impact maybe how fans view the rest of the season, but also maybe if they choose to attend, we could see attendance decline here at Empower Field and Mile High, and this is something that team president Damani Leach has been vocal about. You never like to see that. I mean, there's a lot of different circumstances that impact whether a team, the fans leave or if they stay for a game. We know that the Raiders fan base travels really well anytime that they play here in Denver, so if you have more Raiders fans in the stadium for this game than Broncos fans, that sends a clear-cut message that there's an issue. And obviously, we all know that this season has not gone how the Broncos or even how the fans and the players have hoped for. Certainly how we who cover the team have hoped and anticipated for. It's been a massive letdown from the offensive side of the ball. This will be very big in the eyes of the fan base. If the Broncos cannot beat the Raiders, if they lose 6 straight games against the Raiders, it will define the rest of the season in a negative way, which could force the Walton-Penner Family Ownership Group to step in and make a potential change. Another thing that Denver is playing for, look, division bragging rights. Now, it's unlikely the Broncos are going to compete to maybe even finish second AFC West. I mean, it's always a possibility. The division is not going to be won by Denver, but you have to have pride in the sense that when you're trying to play against people in your division, you want to be able to win, right? Because one thing we see every offseason when we do previews for the season, we have a lot of fan bases from, the Chargers, the Chiefs, the Raiders that say, okay, the Broncos aren't going to do anything this year. Denver so far has proven those guys right. And you have to change that. You have to change that perception. So if the Broncos can get a much-needed victory against the Raiders, get a division win, that's huge, right? They have one more divisional game against the Los Angeles Chargers, where hopefully they can get a win. That's the last game of the regular season here for Denver. And then you have 2 matchups against Kansas City Chiefs. If you can somehow win one of those games, I think it changes and skews the perception just a little bit. But that's a lot of woulda, coulda, shoulda. We'll see how it all pans out this Sunday when the Broncos take on the Las Vegas Raiders. But another question that we're going to answer on today's episode, Locked On Broncos, if the Broncos lose this game on Sunday, will they make a change at the head coaching position? You'll get that on today's episode, Locked On Broncos. But this episode is brought to you by our good friends over there at Turo. Turo is the world's largest car-sharing marketplace, and with Turo, you can book any car you want, wherever you want it, from a community of local hosts. You can browse a huge selection of vehicles for just about any occasion or budget across the U.S., the UK, Canada, and coming soon to Australia. Book a spacious SUV or minivan for a family road trip. Get a classic or luxury car for a special event, a birthday, or a holiday, and find affordable economy cars if you're on a budget and you just need to get from A to B. Test drive that new electric vehicle that you've had your eye on to see how it fits in your everyday life. And many Turo hosts can even deliver the car right to you. Every trip is backed by liability insurance. Terms, conditions, and exclusions apply. Forget boring rental cars and find your drive at Turo.com. If the Broncos lose on Sunday to the Las Vegas Raiders, could they make a change at the head coaching position for the remainder of the season? Thank you so much, Broncos Country, for tuning in and making Locked On Broncos your first listen of the day. Whether you listen on your favorite audio podcasting platform or whether you watch us on your smartphone, your TV, or your computer on YouTube. We appreciate you so much taking time out of your day to tune in to listen to all things Denver Broncos news, content, coverage, and more. Even though that this season has been very disappointing, we still have coverage for you every single day, all year long. Broncos Country, I want you to chime in on this, along the way. If you're watching on YouTube, make sure you comment on the YouTube video your thoughts. If the Broncos lose, will they move on from Nathaniel Hackett? Should they do that? If that is the case, if you're listening on your favorite audio podcasting platform, you can tweet me on Twitter at Cody Roark NFL, at Locked On Broncos. So let's dive into this conversation here, because I think that a Raiders game right now, you look at the Las Vegas Raiders, they're struggling in a big-time way. I mean, you can make the argument they're struggling a little bit more than the Denver Broncos, right? But the Raiders offense can still find a way to put up points that the Broncos simply can't. So there's kind of like this give and take. What is going on with the Raiders? We'll find out a little bit more this week on the Crossover Thursday episode with your boy Q as we break down all the action, the biggest stories on this game on Sunday. But for the Broncos, if they lose this game, do they move on from Nathaniel Hackett? And earlier this week, Nathaniel Hackett was asked whether or not, how do you deal with all the noise, especially, when people are calling for you to be fired? How do you know, if you're essentially coaching for your job? Hackett's answer was, I'd say is very honest, very open. He's like, I've learned every week that you're coaching for your job every week. And that essentially is true in the National Football League. And I think for the Walton-Penner Family Ownership Group, they really like Nathaniel Hackett. George Payton really likes Nathaniel Hackett. But as we all know, this is a results-driven business. And the results for the Broncos offense, especially with the high expectations of Nathaniel Hackett coming in, being the head coach and transforming an offense that was really bad last year, little did we know the offense would be worse than it was last year, which is very hard to imagine under a Pat Shurmur-led offense. But unfortunately, that is the reality right now for this Broncos football team, and I think that's probably the biggest disappointment. We touched on the statistic that if Denver just scored at least 18 points in each of their matchups this season, they're 8-1. And the conversation, the perspective, and the reality of this Broncos season is completely different. But then again, we don't live in an alternate timeline. We can't go back. We can't snap our fingers like Thanos and go back and do things differently. This is the reality of the Broncos sitting here at 3-6. The offense has not been good enough, and the guy who was brought in, tasked to make the offense better, has simply struggled and has not lived up to the bill. And, it's the unfortunate thing, because I've been on the record of saying I really like Nathaniel Hackett. I think as a coach, he cares about his players. He wants to do things that's in the best interest of them. But ultimately, when the results aren't happening, your leash is a little bit short on the National Football League, and the Broncos very well could make a change after the season. I imagine it's probably going to be the reality, but if they lose on Sunday against the Raiders, you have to wonder if they make that change a little bit sooner. What does it mean for the Broncos? I know it's something we're going to dive into here as well. But losing to the Raiders, I want to pinpoint this. Vic Fangio's inability to beat the Las Vegas Raiders was a big reason why he ultimately got fired in Denver. That was a huge thing, and that's a big reason why Joe Ellis kind of stood behind it and said, hey, look, there's Kansas City at the top of the division. They're the juggernaut. The Chargers are rising up, but the Broncos' inability to beat the Raiders and just not be competitive. I mean, Denver has really been blown out by the Raiders in a lot of these matchups, or they've just been wham blasted and they let things go away. It's close in the first half, it dissipates in the second half. We've seen that with this Broncos team, and as you said, 5 straight losing games against the Raiders, one of them being under Nathaniel Hackett's era here as the head coach. You have to find a way to turn that around, and I think that for George Paton, there is a little bit of pressure, right? Because George is essentially the guy that hired Nathaniel Hackett before ownership was ever in place. And so new ownership is going to come in, and they're going to evaluate everything. CEO Greg Penner, the Monty Leach team president, they're going to be very involved in the second half of the season. And they could step in because Greg Penner, when the Broncos were in London, said this: we are expecting a strong second half here from the Broncos, from Nathaniel. So far, it hasn't gotten off to that start. I mean, just a disappointing loss against Tennessee. And I think a loss against the Las Vegas Raiders, as the schedule gets tougher after that. You have the Panthers, you have the Ravens, you have the Chiefs twice, you have the Rams, and you also have the Arizona Cardinals and the Chargers to close out the season. It is not looking ideal, as if there would be a strong finish to the second half of the season. So I'd say a lot of that is all encompassed on Hackett gambling on himself a little bit, right? Because as we talked about in the bye week would have been the perfect opportunity for Nathaniel Hackett to say, all right, I'm gonna hand over play calling responsibilities because I feel like that'll allow me to delegate to Clint Kubiak, whoever he may had in mind to call plays offensively, and to let Ejiro Evero run the defense. I'm gonna manage the team in the day-to-day. It was a huge gamble for him to not hand over those play calling responsibilities. It was something I think we all felt like in the media. Hand it over, because that's one of the things we've seen other coaches delegate. We've seen other coaches like Nick Sirianni give up play calling responsibilities, and all of a sudden they improved. Not saying that Denver would have improved necessarily if Hackett did that, but Hackett is going to live and die on the fact of whether or not he wants to be the play caller for this Broncos offense, and ultimately that will decide the outcome for the rest of the season here for this Denver team. And I think one of the bigger things in the eyes of Broncos country is they liked Hackett at first. They liked his energy. Players love his energy. And, he's positive all the time. He loves on guys. He cares about these guys. But when the offense isn't performing well, fans don't care. Fans do not want to see all the positivity stuff, and I get that. Like we get people all the time in the YouTube comment sections like, "You guys are too positive." We're not trying to be positive. We're trying to be objective. We don't have the emotion that's attached to what's going on in a sense with the outcome of the games, because as fans, there's a lot of hate-driven stuff out there that catches on. Like when you're mad, of course, that's going to be what you gravitate towards. But I'm a big believer, and we are here at the Locked On Broncos podcast about being objective. We're never going to be too negative. We're never going to be too high. We're going to stay right in the middle of things, because I think as fans, you deserve that level-headed approach, right? We're going to come with you with solutions. We're going to come with hypotheticals. What can the Broncos do here? What can they do here? These are the things that ultimately happen behind the scenes when it comes to running a football team. So that's the approach we have here. It meshes well with some people. Some people don't like it. It is what it is. That's okay. But that's how we're going to keep doing the show here, Locked On Broncos. So Broncos country, that is the question of the day here on the podcast. If the Broncos lose this Sunday against the Raiders, do you think that they move on from Nathaniel Hackett after this game? If that is the reality, let us know in the YouTube comment section down below. Or if you're listening on your favorite audio podcasting platform, make sure that you tweet me on Twitter at Cody Roark NFL, at Locked On Broncos. But Broncos country, one of the things we're going to dive into as well, if the Broncos lose and do make a change at the head coaching position after Sunday's game against the Las Vegas Raiders, What does that look like? Does that change anything for the rest of the season? Who would be the interim coach? These are questions that we answer coming up here on today's episode, Locked On Broncos. But this episode of the show is sponsored by our good friends over there at LinkedIn. In these new days, every potential hire can feel like a high-stakes wager for your small business. You want to be 100% certain that you have access to the best qualified candidates that are available. And that's why you have to check out LinkedIn Jobs. LinkedIn Jobs helps find the right people for your team faster and for free. It's super easy to create a job post in minutes. Then all you have to do is add your job in the purple hashtag hiring frame to your LinkedIn profile to spread the word that you're hiring. And simple tools like screening questions make it easy to focus on candidates with just the right skills and experience so you can quickly prioritize who you'd like to interview and hire. It's why small businesses rate LinkedIn Jobs number one in delivering quality hires versus leading competitors. So make sure you end the 2022 year on a strong note with the right hire for your business here today. And LinkedIn Jobs helps you find the qualified candidates you want to talk to faster. Post your jobs for free at linkedin.com/LockedOnNFL. That's linkedin.com/LockedOnNFL to post your job for free. Terms and conditions apply. And our good friends over there, BetOnline.net. BetOnline.net is your number one source for sports betting info, stats, news, and analysis. You can get the latest odds and trends for every professional and amateur league out there. From football to basketball to soccer and esports, we've got it all at BetOnline.net. And if you love sports podcasts, you can find those at BetOnline as well. We're always the fastest and the easiest way to get your betting fix. So head to the website today or use your mobile device to learn more today. BetOnline, where the game starts. All right, Broncos Country, continue on today's episode. Locked On Broncos, free and available everywhere you get your podcasts in audio format or whether you're watching on YouTube. Thank you so much for making Locked On Broncos your first listen of the day. We're playing hypotheticals here this week as we build up for the Broncos matchup against the Las Vegas Raiders here on Sunday. So far, we've talked about what's at stake for the Broncos against the Raiders this weekend from the fan perspective, pride perspective, and also how it pertains really in the division here. And then if the Broncos lose, will they move on from Nathaniel Hackett? These are some questions we've asked on today's episode of the show, just to recap. But now kind of answering those things. If the Broncos do lose and do make a change at head coach after this weekend, what happens? I think the biggest thing everyone's going to wonder first, who would take over as the interim head coach? This is a huge question. There's been people out there, our good friend Benjamin Albright has pointed out, he said, Dom Capers would likely be the interim head coach. I just don't see that being something that Dom Capers wants to do. Dom Capers is a senior defensive assistant. He's up in the box. He's in Ejiro Evero's ear. If anything, I think it makes more sense at this point in time that Ejiro Evero would be the best man for the job to be the interim head coach. And I think that the one question everybody has, if that were to be the reality, how does that impact how he manages the defense, right? I still think he calls the defense, but not only do you have Jerry Rosburg up in the booth as well to assist you, you also have Dom Capers on the defensive side of the ball who's continuing to assist Evero, right? So his focus will be on calling the defense. He can delegate. I mean, Evero could also have an associate head coach, an assistant to him that can also, when he's trying to call the defense, he's got this other guy that he's got on the offense. They're meeting, they're talking about everything as well. I think that'll be a huge thing. I think Jerry Rosburg would be a big help in this situation for a guy like Ejiro Evero. I do think he is the best man for the job in the interim. If that were the move that the Broncos make, if they were to lose on Sunday, if they make that change at any point this season, Ejiro Evero, in my opinion, is a guy who's a rising name, a hot name right now on potential head coaching candidates. He's been a passing game coordinator. He's been around some really great coaches throughout his tenure coaching in the National Football League, and he's a first-year defensive coordinator, and he's got the Broncos playing really damn good football. They're the best scoring defense in the National Football League right now, top-ranked in that asset. They're top-ranked in a lot of other major categories as well, and that's been very impressive to see the opportunities he's been able to create, and they've been dealing with injuries all throughout this season. Ejiro Evero still had the defense playing at an elite level despite injuries, despite guys like Justin Simmons missing some games this year. To me, that is a coach that can maximize guys. Now, I think another question we have to answer here is, what is Ejiro Evero like with the players? And I can tell you this. Being around players, asking players about Evero, they love this guy. They say that he relates to them really well. He's very collaborative in nature. It's not a my way or the highway approach. And I think ultimately he is a true players coach in that sense, and it hasn't seemed to allow him to diminish or to get productivity. Now, when you see Ejiro Evero at practice, when we see him there, he walks around every position group, right, during individual drills. He walks around, he goes and looks at the DBs, he looks at the defensive line, he'll go and look at the linebackers and the other units there, and he's also very involved, he and Dom Capers, and everything that's going on as it pertains to the Broncos defense. They're playing at a high enough level right now, I think it makes sense. But I think a concern that many fans have, well, if Ejiro Evero takes over as the interim head coach for this Broncos team, do they take a step back on the defensive side of the ball? I don't think that would be the case given on what we've seen so far with this Broncos defense all throughout the season with the injuries and the guys that have been missing personnel-wise. They haven't missed a beat. So I think that is a huge thing to focus on there. And I also think that you have to wonder, like, this is an audition as well. If the Broncos do make a change at the head coaching position, do you want to risk losing out on a guy like Ejiro Evero? This is a great audition, I think, for him, if that were the case, to audition to the Walton-Penner Family Ownership Group, George Paton, that he can run this team, that he can be a head coach, and he can still call the defense, right? That, I think, will be a huge gamble because ultimately he goes from being a first-year defense coordinator to a first-year head coach. Where have we seen that before? Oh, yeah, Brandon Staley. He was a first-year defense coordinator with the LA Rams, where he also spent time with Ejiro Evero down there, and then he moved on to become a first-year head coach with the Los Angeles Chargers right after that. So I think that there is the gamble, there's the optics perspective of it, but ultimately I think you hire a guy like Ejiro Evero to be your next head coach, or you risk losing him to another team. And how do you maintain that same level of continuity on the Broncos defensive side of the ball when the defense for this team simply has not been the issue? Denver needs to preserve this going forward. They've got guys locked in. They got some other guys that are going to have to take care of, like Draymond Jones, more than likely going to be a franchise tag candidate. If he does not get an extension done before that time, they'll likely place the tag on him. You have a secondary. You have guys there. You're going to address some stuff in free agency. And you also have the NFL draft where you can build some more depth in the back ends of this year's NFL draft. Denver does have a late round 1 pick. No second round pick, but they have third, and they have the other picks as well in this year's draft. And they could potentially acquire more at some point before the draft process even happens here in the National Football League. So there's a lot of questions here this week, Broncos Country, pertaining to this team and what happens on Sunday if they lose. Let us know what you thought about today's episode of the show. Share your thoughts, what you would do if you were the Walton-Penner Family Ownership Group. If you're George Paton, would you make Ejiro Evero your interim head coach with an audition to be the guy going into next year if the Broncos were to ever make a change at any point this season at head coach? Comment down below. Tweet us on Twitter at Cody Roark NFL, at Locked On Broncos. But that'll wrap up today's episode of the show, Locked On Broncos. Tomorrow's episode, we'll have a crossover Thursday special on YouTube. You always get the crossover episodes. You always get every podcast a day early on YouTube, but you also get it in the audio format on the day of, podcast-wise here. Locked On Broncos podcast. Thank you so much, Broncos Country, making us your first listen of the day. We'll see you tomorrow for a brand new episode of the show.